Probably like recorded for eternity. That's probably recorded for eternity.
Probably, right?
What is that?
Is that like the mega caffeine drink?
It's a monster.
I'm judging by the scratch sign that it's
Energy.
It's an M for monster.
terrible.
That's what I turn into after this. All right, should we get started then?
Yeah.
You want me to do it? You want to do it? Cough cup. Okay. Okay, good morning. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, all right, good. So this is the SACM working group, IETF 97. I'm Adam, this is Karen. Hi, good morning. I'll show you the note well. Just be aware that, you know, things you say, do, can, and will be used against you in a court of law. Just kidding. Not in a court of law, but, well, maybe, it depends. A court of public opinion. Thank you, Jim. All right, administrative tasks. Somebody be a note taker. We need maybe 2 note takers. I think we have 1. Roman, thank you. Do we have another? And while we're looking at this, do we have anybody who's willing to be a Jabber scribe? Oh, thanks, Dave. Nobody wants to take notes. We have 1 note taker. We can live with that. We can live with that.
He's a good note taker.
He's a good note taker. Okay. Good deal. All right, blue sheets are going around too, so don't forget those. Here's the agenda as proposed. Anybody want to bash this agenda? Talk about an architecture reboot, so to speak. SWIMA draft, information model open issues. A little bit on narrowing the information model, some terminology. I don't see Hank, we may not have that one.
I'll be presenting in place of Charles for this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I didn't update that, did I? My bad. Thanks. All right, cool. All right, status. Requirements draft. It's been submitted to IESG, as has the vulnerability draft. Woo. Sorry, I'm happy about that. Yeah, it's good. We're making progress.
Oh, it has been submitted to IETF?
Yeah, just this morning.
Yeah, just.
Vulnerability was yesterday. Requirements just today. So, but we're making progress. All right. Consensus calls that we had from the last virtual interim for issues number 7 and 2 for the software, the SWIMA draft, basically. Those were done, pretty much accepted. Open discussion on items number 3 and 6 are not done. I think we still have to have those discussions. The ongoing information model discussions are ongoing. CoSWID adoption call. There was, you know, a few people that responded to that. We'll probably end up adopting it because there wasn't any strenuous objection. In fact, there were no objections, but we didn't really get the turnout that we expected to see. So we'll probably end up adopting that anyway, but I wanted to talk about that. And the roadmap is still something that's in progress. We said that we'd keep working on that. It is what it is. It's a work in progress. Oops, that's later. Okay. So that's the working group status for the time being. Good? Good? Okay, so we can talk about the architecture reboot. Oops, wrong one. Hello, Jim. Thank you.
So I've never been really happy with the current architecture draft because it doesn't really look like what I think of as an architecture draft. And I finally talked to a couple of people in Berlin and got frustrated enough that I decided I was going to sit down and write something that I thought kind of looked like an architecture draft. And I let people say, no, that's not what we want to do. And then I can just go away and not worry about it anymore. So next slide. So there's a number of things I think that an architecture draft needs to be able to do. It needs to be able to stand on its own as a separate document. You need to be able to pull enough information out of it that you actually can understand what is going on in the world without having to read the information model draft, the data model drafts, the SWID drafts, and all the other drafts. It needs to be something that is written for outsiders. That is, I can take this and hand this to my boss, he can read it, and he can actually understand how the architecture is put together. It needs to describe the components that are part of the system. So it's like, if we are using an authentication system, it needs to talk about the fact that we're using an authentication system. Same thing with an authorization system and all the rest of the pieces. So even if there are pieces that we aren't doing right now, that we're pulling in from someplace else, which we're basically just saying, use these, we need to talk about how they fit into the world because we are using them or we are potentially using them at some point in the future. We need, and then also needs to say how those pieces go together, what protocols you use. We are going to say can go from point A to point B, and so forth. Next slide. So the outline of the current document is basically, here are some components that are part of the system. And basically a component is a functional component. That is, there's a task that needs to be completed. This is the function, this is where that particular task lives. We did a subsection in there on collectors because collectors are actually a bigger piece that we need to talk about because we have a lot of different types of collectors. So it makes sense to pull those out and talk about them separately. There's a list of protocols that are included, and this is basically how do these components talk to each other? And that comes down to the idea of there's going to be a class of protocols, and within that class of protocols, there will be some specific protocols that we say you can use. There may be other protocols that we don't end up listing because we don't think about them at this point in time, or they get listed, or they get created later, or they're proprietary. But if we describe what the class of protocols are and what the requirements are for that class of protocols, it's easy for people to say, yes, this protocol fits in that class, and it can be used to communicate between these types of functional components. It's got a current little thing that basically says there is an information model, and I wanted to talk basically about a little bit of the high-level view of the information model. That is, what information model statements are, how they're put together, but it wouldn't talk about anything like the details of, these are the pieces of the information model. These are things that go in there. That's totally information model document type world. I want to talk a bit about data models because there are some data models that are going to be common, but there are also some things that are not going to be common because we kind of go all over the place on data models. Next slide. So I basically put together from my memory a list of all the different functional components that people had talked about over time, or that I had heard of people and actually understood as being something that was there. Some of these things can potentially be combined together at a later point. I was just trying to be complete, and I may have missed some things. Some things may need to be combined together. I don't know which. But it's just kind of a whole big list. I put something in there called second cloud. That was a misnomer on my part. I don't think of cloud in the same way as the world has used cloud these days. To me, cloud is internet. So that's basically the network that you're looking on. So it's like anybody who talks to the network can talk to anybody else. Next picture. Next slide. Dave contributed this diagram, and this is basically a more focused diagram that looks at the collector part of the world. So basically, you know, what's on the right-hand side is more or less the last picture. What's in the left-hand side is going to talk more deeply about how collectors are, what types of collectors there are, how those talk to something. And he also introduced the concept of a collection controller, which it may or may not be something that stays. I don't know, but it makes a whole lot of sense in a lot of things. And there's a bit of text about that in the document. Next slide. So when I'm looking at a component, there's a set of things that I think need to be on the component. Yes, Dave.
Question from Javer, from Dan Ramascanu. His question was, so is the scope of the SACM work now the internet? He thought we were chartered for more constrained environments. Yeah, and on that note too, I think what the answer to that question is what we're showing here. These pictures are within an enterprise, not
right. Internet is probably the
internet.
word. I mean, network is the right word, not internet. That's probably a misspeak on my part. So it'd be, you know, corporate network, or potentially even a subsection of the corporate network, which is, you know, part of the reason why you have proxies, so you can talk to corporate networks that are in, you know, remote locations. So a component, basically, I mean, it's got a name, so we can talk about it. It's got a description of the things it needs to do. So, you know, you were looking at what I thought an aggregator was. An aggregator is something that looks at pieces of information that have been published in the SACM model and says, oh, this one and this one and this one are all related somehow, and I'm going to make a statement to that effect. And then it pushes that statement back as a new SACM statement. So the interactions that you have with an aggregator are basically you can query an aggregator potentially about information. It's definitely going to query other things. You may get it's going to want async notifications, so it's going to want to be a sync for those. It may produce async notifications, so you can may be able to register and say, when you make new statements about this, I want to know. And it's going to definitely publish back into a data store. So, you know, there's a list of the things, the sorts of protocol interfaces that it needs to support. Okay, next slide. So a protocol example. So one protocol example that falls into the collection classes is NIA. So NIA is it's a collection type protocol. It's description. And I'm actually not sure that that's really an appropriate description, but that's what I understand NIA to be able to do. NIA is basically acts more as a transport and doesn't talk about the data itself, but in other respects, it does talk about the data itself. So it's been too long since I've read NIA documents, and I'm not sure that I'm clear on anymore on those. No, you can just sit for now. It does have authentication. It built into it, and these are the two that I saw as documents when I was doing a fast sweep. There may be some other authentication methods that NIA supports as well. I don't know. In terms of authorization, the only authorization method I know for NIA is basically a pre-configuration sort of authorization. That is, I get told who I'm going to talk to, and that's who I talk to. I don't go out and talk to a third party to find out if that's who I'm supposed to talk to, or if I'm supposed to filter certain things to that person. And I don't know what exactly discovery methods are really supported for NIA. I know a standard one is basically you kind of get hooked up at the time you join the network. But it's like I said, it's been far too long since I've actually looked at NIA, and I was kind of disappearing towards the end of the NIA working group anyway. So it's my view of the world is probably very fuzzy. Next slide. Data model. Okay, so I actually don't have any data models in there, but this is the one that I basically wrote up as an example of the sorts of things I want to talk about for data models. So we have the one ring data model, which is I keep pushing for, and I keep getting pushed back at. What the heck? I'm going to do it in ASN1 because I understand ASN1. Actually, I understand a lot of other things, but I read ASN1 really fast. So I actually have the tool which parses the IM document, dump out an ASN.1 module for me, because I can read through that thing and say, oh, that looks really weird. That looks really weird. Oh, no, that doesn't fit together right, which is a lot harder if I try to do that in schema, XML schema. I just don't read XML schema fast. The operations, I'm not really clear that I got the operations right. Basically, one of the things is a response from a query. Is probably also going to be involved in publishing. So my list of things is not there. We can obviously serialize it out in BER. We can also serialize it out in XML if we want to, for those people who want to actually use XER encoding rules. But yeah, this is something that is from my point of view is a fictitious data model that's never going to get published. It's here solely for Jim to actually understand what's going on and nothing more. Next slide. So now's your time to stand up and yell at me and say, Jim, go away. This doesn't make any sense. And I can no longer worry about having to author this document and be happy.
I've been Bob Moskowitz, HT Consulting. I have been behind in other work, not having looked at it, so I'm a bad boy in regard to that. However, in terms of ASN1 data modeling, which is good stuff and all sorts of things, there is a general movement here in the IETF to do everything young in terms of data modeling. And we are working on a lot of mappings. Like we've had very good discussions in a couple of frameworks this week already on Yang to was it CDL mappings. So we're looking at that to make sure, and actually we're looking at feedbacks back to the Yang people said, you don't have this type in it. So it'd be valuable, and I'm not a Yang person myself to say I would take this on, but to do it so that we can have some consistent presentation across all the different security sort of stuff, to do it in Yang instead of, as well as ASN1.
Well, no, it's not going to be done in ASN1 in this working group, period.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, that's strictly something for me.
Okay.
And nothing else.
If you're doing Yang, then we can do the mapping to let's say to CCDL for a compressed transmission. That's what's needed, or keep it in XML.
Okay, Nancy, you can get up and yell at me about how I don't understand NIA if you want.
You can if you want me to, but I won't. Nancy Camwinjet. So I have a couple questions.
Sure.
When you provided the example for, okay, I'll pick on Nia. You listed that, I think, as a protocol example.
Yes.
And it's just one of many?
It's one of many.
Okay. So, okay, I'm not going to yell at you. So NIA actually provides both the transport and a data model by which posture attributes could be conveyed.
Yes,
So-
but isn't it true that basically I could say the data model for as far as NIA is concerned is a binary blob and put anything I want in there?
Not necessarily. I mean, I'd have to go look at the PB, the TNC-PA posture attributes draft, because that gives you a specific formatting, right? Which to me is a data model.
Yes, that would be a data model. This is, like I said, I'm too far out of NIA to.
Well, that's why. So if I may, right, now I'm going to start mixing all my questions. If you can go back to the diagram,
The first or the second?
the first one.
Okay.
Okay. So I don't know what your intent was when you put up a cloud. I know you mentioned it's the internet.
Well, it is basically this is a network that everybody can talk to everybody over. So there's not a restriction in terms of it's an easier way than to do a point-to-point arrows from every box to every box.
So where I'm trying to come up with the alignment to the previous architecture draft, right, is we called that, I forget, we called it the controller. We said, where I'm
no, I don't have any control functions in this. This is basically.
So it could be just like you had a question on, and you mentioned SACM Cloud may not be the right nomenclature. Yes. We may not have had controller as the right nomenclature, right? A couple of pieces here is the notion of, in the previous architecture draft, because we were lacking clarity, we were trying to run everything in parallel, and I'm not saying right or wrong. It's just the contextual history of why the draft is the way it is. We drew things as abstractly as possible, knowing that we would have to instantiate what in the terminology draft we've been calling out as roles and functions. And so I guess where I'm trying to come up with is this could be the next instantiation of, now that we've gotten further along, we've got both the requirements and the use case scenario now agreed upon and going for publication, that the next phase is really to start instantiating what we really mean by the architecture. My suggestion inside conversations was that the next step would be to go through and make sure whether we start with this as a seed or the old one, or try to do that compromise, but we need to make sure that it serves the purpose of what we agreed would be a first use case scenario. I forget what we call the draft. Vulnerability. My brain's not working. Sorry. Don't crack that. The vulnerability scenario. Yeah. So where I'm trying to get to here is, I guess the concern is there's the notion of the management that comes into the architecture that I want to separate, and this is me, Nancy, separate from the data flow. But also within the data flow, we have security considerations for how, when we transport the information, we'll have to encrypt and so on.
Right. See, to me, all of that is imposed on the protocol, not on the role. Or the
So
cloud.
we may differ on that.
Understand.
Right. And so that's where we need to come back and revisit what I thought we had agreed on, what a role versus a function might be.
Right. And I'm starting from complete scratch. I didn't care about any of that. And I'm perfectly willing to admit that.
Right.
So from that point of view, that's another reason why people can tell me to go away.
So all I was trying to do as the author of the previous architecture was trying to appease to the alignment of the different parallel. Right.
Kathleen Moriarty. So first, as a contributor, I took a look at this document as well as the previous document that had been adopted by the working group, but it was parked, right? So parked because we made a conscious decision to not go ahead with publishing these types of documents at that time. I guess maybe that's more of an AD comment. So, so back to contributor level. So with this diagram, proxy, when I looked at how it's described, it's a terrible word. Let's come up with a new word. Really terrible, terrible word. And I think you can more accurately describe it. Cloud We don't use the word cloud in the IETF. Jim,
Yeah.
you know better.
No, because we used to use the word cloud, but it got changed.
It's dirty. It's a dirty word.
Once upon a time, clouds were nice.
Yeah, they're not anymore. So you can be much more descriptive and say what it is exactly. Now, this overview picture is demonstrating roles more so than I would say the architecture, right? Because in the document, you say that these roles could be combined into different ways of forming the relationships. When I take a look back at the previous architecture document, what I'm seeing is something more that aligns with virtualized infrastructure diagrams, right? Where you do have a controller. It's meeting more more modern networking techniques than this is meeting.
Mm-hmm.
However, because you can combine them in any way, I think you could realistically come up with very similar outcomes for both of these documents. So that's just from my technical evaluation. Now from that, I'm going to put on my AD hat, and we park these documents, right? I'm wondering how useful is it to be revisiting this discussion? And the ISG, we're about to put out a statement. I don't think it went out yet about these types of documents. Again, you know, obviously you've heard the ISG make statements on these kinds of things a number of times, but we have a formal statement coming out encouraging them not to be published. So my recommendation is that we do not waste time, and obviously the working group can decide because consensus drives, right? But my recommendation would be that of the considerations, if we go forward on any of this, is that we take both documents and maybe we link them off of the SACM wiki on the tools page. So if you look at the MILE page, years ago, I had gone and done a whole description of what MILE does. That should be updated, but maybe we could have something similar on the SACM wiki page. And then for architecture, we point at both of these drafts that sit there. And if you want to work on it, great, but I don't see the need of the working group spending cycles on this. I don't think it's going to progress the work. I think we're better off looking at solutions at this stage, because I think solutions could fit into either of these architectures and people could decide to deploy in either direction. Unless you come with a compelling reason from the work that's coming out, the protocol work coming out, that we really have to pick an architecture, I'm not seeing it yet. Someone have a compelling reason? Or can we move on and stick with solution work?
So,
Sorry, may I jump in?
Go ahead.
Okay, this is Hank Burkholz from the Fraunhofer Institute. I wanted to start something completely different, but now I'm maybe first addressing your point of view. We're working on the information model draft quite heavily at the moment, and we want to improve there by giving it more structure. And the discussion this week showed that probably having a concise combined view of both architectures that provides from the current one, from the parked one, the component function and interface concepts as building blocks that you can then build roles from that are depicted here, will enable us to create core concepts and key subjects in the information model, to prune them down, generalize them, and therefore trim them to a level that can be that they can be leveraged way more easy than it is now with this huge list. So there's one driver to have an actual working and published architecture. Also, we have the problem of protocols here, which are depicted in another figure of the architecture. This is left side, right, the collection and second domain, by the way, not cloud, internal communication. And there's a big ambiguity there and a lot of confusion what protocol is used where. And without an architecture, you will be confused where to use what protocol. And Dave also, I think, has a strong point exactly for that. There's another second big point, I think, why we have to have the architecture, not only as a all over changing Wikipedia page, but as a solid point of reference.
All right, so can they be combined in some way?
Yes, I think so. These could be the the other picture could be the outcome of the building blocks that were provided by the first one. We condense that down to the very basic building blocks. Dave will elaborate
How
on
much
that.
time is this going to set the working group back?
So
Not time at all. This
that's a
is
good
actually,
question.
This is actually resolving the remaining
Can I-
issues.
That was to the chairs
that,
and
thanks.
for them to,
Right,
figure this
and we'll
out.
have to figure that out. To me, if we have an architecture draft or not, matters less than the working group organizing what it needs to do.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
what are the operations that we need to worry about? What are those interfaces and so on? This, I think, was an effort to, as Jim started pointing out, with things like this protocol example and naming the different pieces that we care about and what are the operations this thing will support. Having that kind of organization, I think, is important. If it goes into a draft or if it goes onto a wiki,
it could be both.
I just
It could
want to
be
be
a
organized.
draft that
Right.
expires with a wiki that points to it.
Totally.
I just wanted to throw out those options so you guys aren't wasting too much time because this group is much further behind than you should be. And this type of work is what really slows things down dramatically. New working groups starting up, I've made them have all this done before they get formed. Right. So like I2NSF, they had a couple of tables at the hackathon coding up stuff, right? Can SACM do that next time? Can we get to a point where we have protocols, right, that we can start coding and having fun with it?
I'd like to see it. This is Dave. I'd like to see us get there.
Yeah, me too.
Quickly. I personally, on the architecture, I would rather not be doing this work if at all possible. But I think part of the challenge we have is we've been talking about a number of different protocols in this working group. We've talked about XMPP Grid in the past. We've talked about NIA in the past. We've talked about a few others here and there. We haven't had a really good view of where those different pieces fit together. And it's difficult for us to make progress in this working group until we kind of come together on what the end state is that we're actually building. And it seems like we have to do at least some minimal amount of work to define that picture so that we can talk to each other instead of talk past each other.
Basically, then you didn't agree with the previous architecture.
I don't
and what
think
is the sense of the room in that? Is that a couple of people because it was an adopted document, or is the majority of the room having questions on that? And how far apart are they really? If you redraw things in different ways, if you consider, that you're going to have to worry about virtualized environments that do have, I guess you have a collection controller here, right? So, you have there's some similarities here. There really are.
Mm-hmm.
So how far apart are we and how much time do we have to spend on that? Or can we, look at this quickly and do it in a wiki and have something to guide us?
So on that front, I think I'd like to see us try to wrap this document up effectively within the next cycle.
Well, this document or the adopted working group document?
Well, I think we need to come up with an architecture that's going to work for the working group, within the next cycle. My concern, my personal concern with the old architecture is it's way too abstract. That we need to have a little bit more specificity because someone has to ultimately we have to figure out where solutions fit within the architecture, and it's too general in its current form to really work that out.
So the big difference I saw is that you have roles defined.
There really aren't any roles or
new
functions defined.
So why don't you contribute that text to the draft and then figure out how you normalize these? The pictures aren't that far off because there was a controller that, it's splitting top and bottom, but I don't remember all of the pieces. But why don't we pick that apart a bit and think about that, right? Because if you renamed cloud and you rename proxy into actual functions, do they fit into some of the things that are in the existing architecture? And how many people, maybe the chairs can get a sense of how many people are fine with the existing architecture, and when we parked it, they were fine with it then, right? Or how many people think that we need to do all of this work?
Kathleen, in my view, the focus of the two documents is completely different. My focus is I actually don't care whether this document actually gets published.
Okay.
I'm trying to find out what the components are, what the protocols are, what the data models are, and how they plug together. And I'm having a really hard time making some of my arguments to the working group without that. So, for example, I'm, as with my data model up there, I'm a huge fan of the one ring data model. And what I'm getting is we don't need a one ring data model. The 7 ring, the 7 plus 3 plus 5, the data model, having all of those data models is fine, and they're all kind of pieces that the one ring would bind together, but we don't really need those. And without having this idea of, that I understand of how the pieces plug together, I'm having a really hard time arguing that, and they're having a hard time arguing that because we don't have the same view of the world. So, and so this is strictly I'm trying to figure out what are the pieces we actually need. And if it doesn't get published, I don't care.
Okay. Customers too, and to the working group chairs, like, can we figure out what do customers care about? Who are we building this for?
Right.
And are they going to decide their own architecture anyway? So can we do this quick? Does it have to be more detailed? What's the level that we have to get to? Or does it have to be done at all? Can we just Wikify it? Or can a few people just spend some time on the 2 documents and see if just adding content in makes sense, and then see if the working group agrees with that? There's lots of options here. I was just a little surprised to see this come up after, we had a document and it was parked and the working group had made a conscious decision. So it kind of surprised me.
Yeah, obviously you didn't look at the roadmap, which had the #1 priority be an architecture document, which was brought up in the last 2 interims.
It was, okay.
Okay, we're about out of
Sorry.
one.
There was this confusion about protocols I was talking about just before, and you just reiterated that. And that is exactly the point why this separation has to happen. There is a confusion because on the left side, there are all those many, and you can use them wherever you want. And on the right side, there is the one that you want. That is the only one, the single one, the downstream one. So the confusion is basically architectural. And although this document is coming from you, there's still that confusion. And that is confusing to me. And on the other hand, there is the capability, there's the I2NSF you mentioned, group that is developing quite well at that point. They have an information model and a capability draft that is starting to align actually with our architecture. So
which architecture? Because I'm confused now.
No, it is starting with the old.
Which the old?
The old, yeah.
Yeah.
So we are. That's why I think the building blocks from the old architecture are working really well.
Yeah.
We can define these roles with it, and that is your actual concern, and this is achievable in the time frame Dave highlighted, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, there are pieces of the existing architecture I like because it's going to fit in a virtualized world better. And that's one of the viewpoints, and that's probably why I2NSF likes it.
Right. I think we'll have to take a look at that, and
yeah.
we'll look and see what we can do, what we need to do, if we need the draft or if we don't need the draft, whatever the case might be. But
when I looked at them this morning, I skipped a meeting to go through these. That was what really stood out to me. It looked more like a virtualized architecture that I'm used to seeing, in my workplace, and this looks like a more traditional architecture.
What the solution we need to provide, though, has to cover both.
Yep.
Right. So
and
if we're looking at the architecture, right, and to me, this could do that too. This could be virtualized just as easily. It's
just drawn a little differently than I'm used to. So.
Right. I agree, and I'm not. but we do have to satisfy both worlds.
So one jabber comment on this topic.
And then we're done.
So Jess had indicated in Jabber that she liked the second picture of Jim's slides, which I think is the slide number 5.
Yes.
Here, she says it describes the endpoint as a role in the architecture. She thinks that that's an important concept to capture in whatever documentation this group puts forward. That's actually one point that I've always had some concern around in the original architecture, which is this working group is about assessing the posture of endpoints, and the endpoint doesn't really appear in the previous architecture.
So the concept of roles, adding that in might help a lot. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, Jim. Huh? No. Thanks for the opportunity, though. All right. What's up next? We have Swimma. Who's doing that one? Is that David? And this one, yes?
I'm sorry? Yeah, that's the right one. Okay, so this is about Swimma, software inventory messages and attributes, the draft formerly known as SWID M&A, software M&A, so and so. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to give a quick status on where we are with the draft and spend the bulk of the time on discussing open issues, and then briefly touch on our plans moving forward for the draft. Next slide, please. So the status. So we've had a lot of discussion of the draft over the last few interims. We talked at the last virtual interim in October about a couple of issues. Issue 2, about whether we should include software identifiers in all reports, have that be effectively the way of identifying what software we're talking about in a consistent way. And issue number 7, focusing on the collection of installed software only. There was some interest in the working group to cover both software inventory as well as running software on a device. And so on that note, we decided in the last virtual interim that the focus of this draft will be on software inventory only, and that if we want to address running software or any other aspects of software, that we'll create an additional draft to cover those topics. So we have made some updates to the draft based on the points of discussion. Another point of decision was that we'd like to rename the draft from SWID M&A to software inventory M&A, and I think that is work that still needs to be done. We also need to resubmit the draft as -IETF instead of, so we'll do that. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to jump right into a handful of issues that we're currently working through. So the first one is one of the issues that were brought up at the last virtual interim, and I think there's been some discussion on the mailing list, was to include the installation location of the software as part of the reported software inventory. So it seems like the general, that some consensus is emerging around the need to add this software installation location information, because that information can then be used to drive follow-on activities relating to the software, management activities, whether it would be, making modifications to the software, configuring the software, or whatever. So we included text in 03, adding a software locator to the software inventory message. The software locator contains a single URI that represents the software installation location. It defines 2 schemes, but these can be extended. The first scheme is file, which is a location relative to the endpoint's local file system. So the file URI scheme will allow for a cross-platform, file identifier, essentially. The other scheme is unknown, which means that the location cannot be determined within any reasonable degree of confidence. when it's a file, it should be, the text in the draft says that it should be the root directory of the software's executable. The location should, in the case of there being multiple executables that accompany the software, it should be the location identifying identifying where the primary executable is located. So this is effectively guidance to drive more consistent reporting of software location. Next slide, please. So this is an example of where the software locator fits within the larger message structure of software inventory M&A. So we added the software locator, which is the second from the bottom. Next slide, please. So closing out this issue, there was some concern raised since the virtual interim that it may be difficult to determine, the location of some aspects of software. It could be loaded into some RAM disk. It could be on a remote file system. It could change over time. We're looking for feedback on, does the current URI location approach provide enough, support to address some of these edge cases? We also wanted to acknowledge that unknown is not an IANA registered URI scheme. So are we comfortable with using unknown? Another option might be, instead of using the unknown URI prefix or URI scheme, to use a 0 byte length for the software locator. Simply use an empty software locator in the message. So we're looking for some feedback on these approaches. Any opinions on where we should go?
Hi, this is Hank again. The URI seems, of course, to be a top choice. Unknown might be a little bit, maybe there are some categories of unknown, like there might be an error why you cannot resolve the location. It might be unavailable, it might be corrupted, and it might actually be unknown. But if this case really sets in, how do you know the software is there in any place? Maybe the SWIT tag is there in error. Maybe the software isn't there and it cannot be known. So there might be categories of unknown that are very vital to the assessment of the security. So that might be a little bit better, I guess.
Chris Ignacio, can you rephrase the question to see if anyone cares if we use unknown or not first, as opposed to trying to get opinions on it? Because I got to say, pick something and move along. So I don't care if you call it dog food, but just as long as it's well defined in the standard as to what it means.
Sure.
I agree completely. I was thinking the exact same thing.
It doesn't sound like anyone does, so we'll pick something and move along. So the next was issue number 4. There was a request to support user or vendor-defined data models. Software inventory records allow you to also transmit information that may be present on the device that's represented in some data model, like a SWIT tag as an example. We have been working to establish an IANA registry that will enumerate the supported data models by the specification. I believe at the last virtual interim, it was brought up that it would be a good idea to also support user or vendor extensions. We're proposing that we use a byte field within the message where the most significant bit would be 0 if it's referring to an IANA registry entry, a 1 if it's a non-registered value. The second most significant bit for a non-registered value would be 0 if it's user-defined, or 1 if it's vendor-defined. This would effectively allow 64 data models to be used for vendor and user characterized data models, and 128 data models to be defined within the IANA registry, which we think is, a whole lot relative to what will actually be needed. Any concerns with this approach?
Chris Ignacio, just plan for a model where a vendor defines a data model and then it gets into the IANA registry.
So what you want us to be able to do is to convert that vendor defined model to a registered entry?
Because it's going to happen.
But couldn't that just simply be registering the entry and working to move implementations towards the registered value?
So then vendors burn some of their numbers along the way to registered ones. If you're a vendor, do you want to go to the IANA registry first?
Well, I mean, effectively, that works the same way in a lot of IANA registries right now, where you use some kind of vendor prefix.
Yeah, but they also tend to give you like a 32-bit value, and so you have 31 bits worth of defining your own.
Any suggestions on how to address that?
The other thing there is, if you get interoperability, and if you have old versions, from whichever vendor, how do you know from a vendor that vendor 7 is equal to IANA 14?
You wouldn't. There would be no direct mapping there.
Well, yeah, but they may be the exact same thing, and wouldn't it be nice if they were?
I don't know. You tell me.
Yes. Sorry.
Bob Moskowitz, in a lot of areas, we have adopted using the IANA enterprise number, like for doing things in certificates that on ASN1 encoded stuff. But it is trivial for any vendor to get an IANA enterprise number. I have mine. I have my 6715. I did it quite a while ago, and they're up to 60,000 or something like that right now. But it's like you just give you information and boom, you have an enterprise number, and now you have a number that you can any vendor can have and can use it. It's not really saying, gee, where do we go to invent a number for this?
Is that a 32-bit number?
It's
16-bit.
It is an integer field, and it's just growing as more and more grow. And it's up to 2 to the 32. It'll fit in 2 to the 32. I don't think it's ever going to get to 2 to the 32.
Right. Well, we're talking about using an 8-bit field here. So
it's bigger than that already,
message.
because it's already up to 60,000. Some, I think, is if you go to type in this IANA enterprise number, you'll see what they're up to now. But it is one thing to do, and it's basically it is unbounded. It does require a larger field, but anybody can get it, and there's no question. And saying, well, who has what number, and how do we fit into this little 8-bit field? How many vendors might there be?
So I guess we're going to have to weigh the message size trade-off versus the flexibility that solution would allow. So I think we need to think about that and propose something back to the list. So in the interest of time, I'd like to move on. So issue number 1, identification of data sources. So throughout the past few virtual interims, and I think at the last face-to-face, there was a lot of discussion and interest around including the data source of each software record. This would be useful because different data sources provide maybe more or less accurate and characterizing the installed software on a device. They may instantly know of a software install, or may have some lag time involved before they can actually capture whether a piece of software is installed or not. And that this is useful. Understanding the source and some notion of its characteristics is useful downstream to understand to contextualize the software inventory information that's being collected. Some possible data sources would include information directly from the file system, information from a package manager, information from software discovery tools, that forensically analyze the file system to determine what's installed. So we believe that there's interest in adding a data source field to the software inventory message. Are there any concerns with us doing so? So it sounds like no. So we'll work on adding such a data source field in the next draft. Issue number 5. Clarify that software inventory message and attribute servers must accept all data models. So the idea here is that the current draft doesn't impose any requirements that would require the server side of the exchange to be able to parse or understand a data model that's used as a payload in a software inventory message. So as a result, we believe that it's important that the draft be explicit about the fact that servers should not reject a message just because it doesn't understand the data model in the message. We believe that the authors believe that it should either parse that message or silently ignore the message if it doesn't understand it. Is there any concern with us explicitly stating that the server should either parse the message or silently ignore it? Okay, so we'll add some text to describe that behavior. Next slide, please. Issue number 6, MTI data models. So the MTI data models really affect what data models a given client is capable of providing to the server. So in the current draft, we have 2 data models. We have the ISO 2009 SWID tag format, which is an XML-based serialization format. We have the ISO 2015 SWID tag format, which is also XML. We've been talking within this working group about concise software identifiers as another option, but it's not currently supported in the internet draft. So we really have 2 questions. Would there be any concerns with us adding ISO 2015 or CBOR-based SWID tags, the co-SWID tags, to the IANA registry? Jim, I see you shaking your head. You have no problem? Does anyone have a problem with that? Okay, so we'll add those to the IANA registry. And then we also have a larger question about do we need to include MTI data model requirements in this draft? Should it be in a separate draft? Are there any feelings about what would be appropriate here? Without having an MTI, there's risk that certain clients won't be capable of sending certain data models.
So if we're looking at systems which are currently publishing these, I'm assuming that 90% of them are currently publishing 2009. Is that a reasonable assumption?
So, well, there's no we're actually working on implementations around this draft, but systems do have 2009 SWID tags installed on them. There are a smaller number of systems that have the newer 2015 SWID tags installed on them. I don't know of a system that has a CBOR-based co-SWID.
Well, since it's not finished yet, I'd be surprised. I mean, my assumption is right now, if you don't do 2009s, you're not going to understand 90% of the SWID tags out there. So right now, that kind of seems to be the MTI. But I think you may end up in a situation where you have to do both of the XMLs as MTIs, because hopefully people are going to progress from one to the other, but you're still going to have all those old SWID tags lying around that you're going to have to understand.
Yeah.
So I'm not too sure you're going to be able to get away with saying the MTI on the server side, at least, is going to be anything less than all of them.
So all of them being the 2009 and 2015.
And potentially even the CBOR once it gets established.
Okay. So one other point of information, I participate in the ISO group that developed the SWID tag specification, both the 2009 and 2015 versions, as well as Tag Vault, which is like an industry consortium. And both of those groups are actively trying to get the industry to migrate to the 2015 standard because it's a better format. It provides more information and it does it in a much more useful way. So that is also a factor here. They would like to see the 2009 version, fade silently into the night, but that's not going to happen for some time.
Roman Danilou. So question exactly to the topic you were talking about. Could you talk a little bit about the penetration of 2009 versus kind of 2015? I mean, how much are we really talking about losing if we only say 2015?
Yeah, there's a handful of vendors that are doing 2009 for a handful of products. We're kind of at about the same level right now with 2015. So the impact isn't huge. I don't know of a lot of software inventory tools that are relying heavily on SWID tag information right now. They're still largely doing their own thing forensically and discovering software. So it seems to me like the impact is fairly small with excluding 2009 as an MTI.
Yeah, I would nudge towards 2015.
Okay, so it sounds like the guidance I'm hearing is that we should make 2015 MTI. Do we want to?
We can
pull that, or
we can pull it here, or just take it straight to list if you want. No, and nobody's objecting. So
we could work up some text around the 2015 MTI issue, and then ask for a review on the list if anyone has any concerns.
Good.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you. Next slide, please. So that's it for the issues. I think these are all of our current outstanding issues. So we're going to work on resolving the remaining issues and a new draft, and would like to confirm the discussion today on the list. Our plan is to post the next draft as draft IETF SACM-20161115-0930 SWIMA 00. We'll work as quickly as we can to get those addressed, probably within a couple of weeks after this meeting. Okay. We'd like to work towards a working group last call early next year, maybe January, February timeframe, if that's okay with the chairs. We would like to see more review of the document between now and then.
Good.
So that's it.
Okay. Thank you. Is everybody signing the blue sheet? Okay. Is the right one?
Yeah. I think it's the one with the references. Yeah, we're good. Wow, those are really tiny.
I can just go to that one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
All right.
we can just go to the next slide. So today, basically just talk about a couple open issues as well as next steps. We can just dive right in. This could potentially be, we could potentially get stuck, I think, on this particular issue, or it could be pretty quick. We'll see what happens. So over the last 2 virtual intro meetings, we've been kind of talking about, okay, so we have the IM, and let's kind of start thinking about working on data models. There's kind of been some discussion around, do we really need some kind of like single, unifying data model for SACM, or, do we really want to just focus on how do we enable SACM to just leverage all these existing other data models that are out there? So there's quite a few that are of interest to our group, especially as far as things like configuration. You have CI, the Common Information Model from DTMF, configuration profiles. That's what Apple uses for their products. There's MIB, Yang, SWID, and Oval. And so, I think one of the main drivers between actually supporting multiple data models is the fact that, with the work we've done on SCAP and Oval in particular, having a single data model for collecting information off of an endpoint is not sufficient. Certain vendors will be happy to support it. Other vendors, they have their own ways of doing things, and they would like to use that. So we really need to focus on kind of broadening our ability to use these other data models to really get the scope of the different types of endpoints we want to collect information on. So, and I guess the good news is, out of the discussion from the last couple of virtual interim meetings, everyone seems to be in agreement on this. I don't think anyone's like, we need just a single data model for all of SACM. So that's good. And then we've also, in working on the IM, we kind of built out a structure for this is how we're going to define the different information needs and all that. And, we asked for input on, what are the different things we want to represent, whether it's metadata necessary to get information from SACM component to SACM component, or, certain information that we may want to collect off of the endpoint. We didn't get a ton of feedback there. So basically what we did is we went through SWID and we went through Oval and pulled out a bunch of information that we thought might be useful in supporting kind of our general use cases, but we kind of also focused on the types of information we care about in the SACM vulnerability assessment scenario. And in putting that out there, all that information, the feedback we got was, hey, that's way too much. Let's trim it down. And we can do that. I think we need help from the group to decide, though, what are those pieces of information we need to collect and that we want to keep in there. And there is also kind of thoughts of, so like 2 meetings ago, we pulled out this kind of notion of a SACM statement and content element, which are basically envelope constructs that would be used to transport information between SACM components. And at the last meeting, there was a desire to put them back in. So we did that. And kind of beyond that, we really just need to, I think, when we're kind of looking at the list of information needs for SACM, the big things I think we need are, what's the different metadata necessary for completing SACM tasks. So to give you an example, some of the tasks are collection, evaluation, discovery of target endpoints, characterization, being able to understand, how an endpoint's made up so that you can determine which, guidance is applicable to it. Go ahead, Dave.
There was a question from Dan Ramascanu on Jabber. Can you detail the statement about one data model is not enough? Do you mean one data model or one data module?
So, yeah, I think in reality, the SACM data model kind of as a whole will be potentially made up of several different data models, right? SWID could be one data model, which is essentially, I guess, a subcomponent of the SACM-IM that supports software inventory information. Oval could be configuration, and kind of collectively they form the SACM data model. But just saying, hey, everyone use Oval and that's all we're going to do is not going to work.
I think you're just hitting a terminology difference from the groups that Dan participates to.
Okay.
The background and experience of this group. So Dan is correct within his terminology world module.
Okay.
Yeah, and
You're both right.
Oh, okay.
It's just different terminology sets used.
yeah, and this is Dave Waltmeyer. And personally, I think there's a lot of work that's been done in creating data models for management protocols out there. Lots of work in the IETF around Yang modules. There's also a bunch of proprietary models that are used for managing, specialized devices as well. And we have a couple of problems, I think, as far as implementation. We have the desire to be able to write content that can be used to evaluate, to assess, endpoint devices of a lot of different types. We need to be able to use what's available on the device in order to evaluate that content. And we also have the implementation challenge of, we can't. It's difficult to force implementers to pick, a specific implementation approach, because there aren't always standardized models to cover the full breadth of configuration settings that are possible on the device. So acknowledging, that that's the reality that we exist in, and being able to accommodate that reality is kind of what we're getting at when we say we can't, one data model isn't enough.
Yeah. So I guess kind of just getting back to the last bullet. So there's also kind of been some recent discussion around kind of provenance and chain of custody. I think, with that respect, the group wants to be able to support it using the information that's collected from endpoints and that may be generated, with things like timestamps and, which components are collecting the information and things like that. But I don't know necessarily that we need to define what it is at this point. And then I guess lastly, that data model comprehension thing is basically, so within these SACM statements and content elements, we need metadata that enable the different SACM components to understand, okay, if we're going to leverage all these different data models, what's in here and how can I, how can I know how to process it and what to do with it? Kathleen?
Kathleen Moriarty, I guess, contributor. For that, Jim should be able to help on the data provenance stuff. But when you get to that with Cozy, Jose, or whatever makes the most sense.
Okay.
I don't want to sidetrack, but
all right.
That's.
Thank you. And then, yeah, obviously we need to know, what are the different pieces of information we want to get off the endpoints, and then basically how do we drive these assessments with things like collection guidance. Here's what I want to go collect off the target endpoint. Here's how I want to evaluate it, and things like that. So the next slide kind of veers off a little bit, because in kind of having these discussions, and I've heard from a couple people kind of like, what's the end goal? Like, what are we trying to do? And, for me, I guess, at least in my head, let's provide this kind of, standardized framework, for SACM that enables us to take in, essentially any data model that fits our space, and be able to enable end users, organizations, system administrators to, collect, evaluate, query, store this information in a way that they don't necessarily have to know, what are these underlying protocols and data models? Because when you have to do that, it's a lot of information to, need to, okay, I do it like this way using WMI and SIM, or I do it this way with Apple configuration profiles, or, with netconf, I do it this way. That's a lot. So if we can kind of take that having to know all those little details, I think that could help people in this. I think it gets to the point of really just trying to, like, I don't know, I guess I think it just, if we kind of, maybe if people agree with that, like, I think it might kind of help focus, and maybe if we kind of keep that in mind, kind of help some of the maybe differences in, understanding, like when we talk about things like the architecture and stuff. I don't know. To me, it seemed like it might help, but maybe it doesn't. Go ahead, Dave.
I think the only suggestion I would have for this SACM end goal is I'd like to constrain it just a little bit more than where it currently is. I would say, instead of saying security automation information, I would say security posture information, to be more specific. We are talking about using guidance and other kinds of security automation information, but that information is in support of discovering, characterizing, collecting, evaluating, querying, and storing posture information.
Yeah, I kind of use the broader term to capture all that stuff as well. And I mean, so I guess, do anyone else have thoughts on, like, is this kind of what we think we're working towards, or is there something that seems off here? Okay. And all right, so I think we can pretty much go to the next slide. And I think this kind of gets to when we were talking at an architecture session about kind of, moving forward and kind of, at least with respect to the information model, this is kind of the steps I see kind of as we're going through, to get where we want to be. These are the different things we have to do. So one of the first things we need to do is define the SACM tasks. And Hank put those in the terminology document. We worked on those. There's some inputs, like, for example, a collection task takes collection guidance, which specifies, how and what to collect off of an endpoint. As output, you get collection results, which are essentially posture attributes with the associated metadata. And we defined different tasks like that. I think, have we received any feedback on that yet? Because I think this can kind of also help, understand these are the different things we need to do. So how do we enable those?
So this is Hank again. Yeah, we got limited feedback on that, not on the list though. And one of the reasons for this is that we, and that's basically one of the big good things that's come from the new architecture stuff. We don't have a defined interaction model.
Mm-hmm.
So the things that are happening between interfaces, the inputs and outputs, are like a limbo thingy, very abstract. So if we define interactions and the interaction model, which are basically the operations, it enables us to get people really understand what we need here, why we have different kind of guidance and how they actually look like, and how to actually select existing models for that. So I think input stopped coming in about shortly after the last meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to basically, by defining these functions and interfaces now via the architecture, I think, have the basic for the foundation for actually having then these inputs and outputs defined. I think there's a sequence in work here. And we're starting to try pull in the inputs and outputs of the tasks. But the tasks are the composite of functions that are now in the components. So I think by having these functions defined, it is way easier to define the input and outputs for all the tasks you actually can conduct. And we will use the vulnerability assessment scenario as a first step for this. So I hope this will drive that better.
Yeah. Sounds like you may be thinking bottom up, and I'm thinking kind of maybe top down.
But we tried the one and then we stalled it a little bit. So we have to fill up the missing pieces. That's why I think that we are actually resolving the remaining issues right now.
Yeah. And I think, kind of as we go through this, it will help gain clarity there. So, with the information model, obviously we have the information, we have the ability to capture the things we care about. You know, as I mentioned, we're still, you know, looking for feedback on what exactly those things are, because we definitely do want to trim it down. And the vulnerability assessment scenario gives us some of that, but there are other things as well. So I guess, and then, you know, kind of Hank already talked about the operations interfaces. So the other discussion that kind of came out of this whole thread on GitHub was, so how do we really go about unifying all these data models, right? There's kind of two approaches, I think, to that. The one that we've been currently kind of, or I guess have been working towards, is basically we define the IAM, we define the different information needs that we care about. And then at some point, once we decide which exact, you know, which data models we want to use, I mean, the group has some in mind, but no one said, hey, we're definitely going to use this, we're definitely going to use that. And then anyways, once we would pick that, we would say, okay, you know, in netconf, you know, this Yang module aligns with this information element, this oval item, you know, aligns with this, and so on. And so that's kind of where we're working towards now. But there's also been a suggestion to basically, you know, provide, rather than doing that kind of full mapping, provide metadata that enables SACM vendors that would, you know, implement these solutions to be able to create these mappings on their own. And so we can just hop over to the next slide. I basically just broke that question out, and so we can kind of talk about it a little bit more. And so these are the two different options here. And I think the main driver behind kind of enable, you know, let's see if we want to enable the vendors to make the mappings themselves, is because potentially modeling an endpoint, if you want to try to cover every possible thing that you may want to collect, it's a lot of work. And when you just defining it would be a lot of work, and then also doing the mappings for, you know, each data model you do, there's just even more work. And so it's kind of a trade-off between, you know, where we do the work on the front end or on the back end, and then also, you know, what's the level of standardization we need between these, you know, kind of understanding these data models. For example, if everything maps back to the IM, it's going to be very clear this is how the mapping's done. Whereas if you're working with a vendor-defined approach, there's, I think, the potential for inconsistencies between how they do it, but maybe it's not that big of a deal that it would be okay. Go ahead, Jim.
Jim Schott. My first comment would be doing the first one. If we do the first one, we must not preclude the second one.
Okay.
Because the second one will still be required for vendor proprietary models.
Yeah.
So that being said, I think that there's too much benefit to the first one not to do it. Is where I would come down.
I guess, yeah. So, oh, go ahead, Dave.
Dave Waltermeyer. So I think in theory this sounds good, but it's hard for me to really imagine what this looks like in a practical sense. One of the things we've been talking about over the last few days is it would be really good if we could, you know, take something like the vulnerability assessment scenario and, you know, start envisioning what one or two enterprise scenarios might look like. You know, Kathleen, you mentioned virtualization. We also talked about kind of a classical enterprise scenario. It would be kind of useful to think about this in that context and about, you know, what are the information interactions that would need to exist to make this work? What kind of data would be exchanged between those in a vulnerability assessment scenario? In an abstract way, what would that data look like? You know, what are some of the properties that we're talking about here? And then use that as a backdrop to actually drill into, you know, very detailed specifics about what this would actually look like from an information model perspective. Having those examples, I think, as a backdrop for this discussion would be really useful in understanding what we're actually talking about on this slide. I think personally that would help a lot for me, and it would get us more towards doing the code sprint, kind of thing that Kathleen was talking about as well.
So are you suggesting we don't know enough yet to answer this question exactly?
I think it would be helpful to have a more detailed, do a deep dive conversation around. I mean, we have a tendency to talk really high level and abstract about kinds of things, and it's not as useful, I don't think, because we're not getting down into implementation details. So if we were to dive deep on some of these topics, kind of look at what the stack looks like, and then push through, that might actually help.
I agree.
And I think I would point out that for things like determining whether or not you have vulnerable software in your system, if you think to like the vulnerability assessment scenario, that is much easier than when you get into things like configuration, because there may be some kind of high level like common concepts across there, but it very quickly you have to start diving down into things that are specific for individual platforms. So that's just something I think we have to maybe work through.
So basically we don't have enough to say that we have a preference on which approach we take yet, I think.
Possibly, yeah.
Right. I think we need to learn more first about exactly what the operations are and what the data looks like before we can figure out how we might be able to do the enveloping and all that.
Right. I feel like that's where we're at.
Yeah.
So I guess, from having looked at the vulnerability assessment scenario and, maybe the information that's in the IM, does anyone have any like key things that like, hey, this might be a good example to look into to kind of flesh this out? Or
Kathleen Moriarty. So from looking at other drafts coming through and Yang modules that are starting to pop up, I'd love to see you guys inserting yourself more into the specific Yang modules, because we've already missed some opportunities, although there is something called the Yang patch, and so there are ways to update Yang modules, but we're missing inserting ourselves into places where you could get some of the data that you need, where they're meeting most of your needs but not all of them because their focus isn't the same. So I don't know how many people in the room are actually paying attention. I mean, Yang modules are spread throughout the groups in the IETF, right? Mm-hmm. So we kind of have to do a divide and conquer and work to fit some of those in. But I do think it's important to leverage the work that's out there and getting deployed, and that operators are jazzed about at the moment.
So maybe given that, because things like Oval, they do support like checking network infrastructure devices, maybe given things like NetConf and their use of Yang models, maybe that would be a good approach to take.
Yeah, well, you don't want to ask a vendor to implement Oval on a network device.
I agree.
Right? They're already doing Yang, so they're going to say no, right? You want to get yourself inserted into the Yang module and have that do what you need to do for the checking. And that's going to be the most effective way to, get the vendors in that space, use what they're using. But that means we've got to spread out and, look at the Yang modules getting published and figure out what other things do they need to be checking.
Okay.
This is Hank, and just Kathleen, directed at you. Do you have in mind more like well-established models like entity maps, or current work like the stuff that is, for example, the information model in the I2 NSF, which is also built on Yang?
So Yang, the work is just starting to come through, right? So I've read the through for publication, and I think it's going to be happening all in a hurry now. Some of the main, the core documents have come through. So I've read those now, and they're in the publication queue.
For example, just one example.
That's the core, right? So just so you know what I do, I read all drafts right before they're published, right? So I'm getting them. They might have been worked on for 3 years, and I see them right before they're published.
Okay.
But I know that there are, at least 60 or more, probably 100 or more. Dan, if Dan could chat and say how many, is Dan still on? Or maybe he dropped off. Time zones are terrible for other people. So, I mean, Dan could tell you how many there are. Dan might be able to help point us in the right direction, or Benoit is the main person. Yeah. So
Yeah. Okay. So
they're huge, but
I know.
So if we're not going into the right places, then you're not getting these things added, right? So the main one, there could have been some places we're adding. I don't know. Benoit might be able to help. The routing area has a lot of Yang module work happening too. So the management area and routing, I think, are seeing the most. And, this group could come up with what, we think is a specific Yang module too. But you have to be more steeped in that. I'm not. Like, I don't know exactly what all of the trees look like for these modules, but...
Yeah, because now that we have established that the Yang model does not confine us to netconf, but we can derive
RESTconf
other,
too.
Yeah, but yeah, also, but we can derive other message and data models from that. Basically, is a good idea to get maybe the common ground on Yang again, maybe, but not restricting us to netconf.
Right, netconf and RESTconf are the recommended protocols, but it doesn't restrict you to those.
Yeah. There are some transformation problems there. There's some unique constraints to Yang that are a hassle, but I think in general it might be possible.
Sure, there's probably going to be a hassle with everything once you get it down and you're deployed, right?
Just for people to look at, there were 2 Yang projects that occurred at the hackathon. So if you go and look on the hackathon webpage, you'll be able to find them. One of them was dealing with doing a catalog of all of the Yang modules. And the second was dealing with something about some way of looking at how the Yang modules fit together in a tree in terms of what needed what. So both of those may be useful in terms of starting to do a survey of Yang models for this purpose.
Thanks.
Dave Waltermeyer. I also wanted to point out NetMod, the working group for the modeling language, the Yang modeling language is meeting in the session right after this one, if you're interested.
All right, great. All right, so I guess in the interest of time, which we have 4 minutes. So yeah, we can go to the next slide. So this should be a quick one. This issue was discussed at the last virtual interim meeting, basically just a clarification question as to whether or not attribute and subject names are unique within the information model, or do they have to be unique within their particular instantiations within data models. So as I was it seemed kind of the outcome was they have to be unique within the information model, and I was going to clarify text, and I realized, well, I think we maybe already have this covered in the naming conventions, which says there'll be a registry of names and they must be unique. So I guess really I just wanted to check with the group to make sure that this covers that question. I guess I'm looking at you, Jim, since you raised it. But if it's all good, we can just kind of close this one out. Yeah. All right. Cool. All right. So I think we're good on that one. We can move on. And so this is another one that was discussed the last week or so leading up to the meeting, and this was around when we were looking at some things in the information model. We basically have a software instance which generically defines a piece of installed software. Things like you get the software name, version, identifier, things like that. But we also had some OS specific information elements, things like OS version, type, component. And there's a question of, well, if we already have the software instance, do we really need these OS specific ones, or vice versa? Is there kind of a preference on either? And the group seemed to think that either would be okay. However, there was kind of, the having to specifically call out, OS version versus firmware version versus operating system or application version that might be kind of redundant. So there's a suggestion to kind of maybe in that software instance information element define a type or a class where you can say this is application, this is operating system firmware, and pointed to the common information model software identity. Data model defines a few different types, and also RFC 2790 does as well. So I guess I was just looking for input on the group as to, since the group thought both were okay, can we just pick one? I don't know that we need to have both. I guess if I had to pick, I think I would pick the more generic software instance. However, I guess it maybe gets down to, is there really a lot of differences once you get into these different types of software, whether it's firmware, operating system, or whatever? Are there things that we aren't going to necessarily be able to capture? What's that? Choose and go? All right.
Classification.
That works for me.
Classification.
All right. Go ahead, Dave.
Dave Waltmeyer. I think anything that reduces the number of classes and attributes that we have is a good thing. So,
Okay. So that's a +1 for the generic. All right. Thanks. Okay. With that, since we're pretty much running out of time, we'll just hop over the thing. Next steps, we're just going to keep working on these on the list and keep closing them out and just driving them to consensus and be done with them. So, yep, that's all I have.
That's it?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. That means I'm next, I think. I'm going to sit here. Let me find it. They can see me. You really want me to get up there? I just can't read it at the same time. All right. Just because I want to be able to read my slides at the same time, because I haven't actually memorized this thing, I'm going to sit here. Is that okay with everybody? You guys good with that? No? They can. Can't they see me? No? All right. All right. Because I'm up here, then I'll be doing this a lot. So sorry, but that's okay. So this isn't really, I don't know if this is as a contributor or as a chair or what, but this is kind of some background on what I see day to day in benchmark development to help us maybe take a perspective to narrow what we need to do for the information model elements. So next slide. Did it work? Oh, great. Okay, cool. So my organization, Center for Internet Security, publishes benchmarks, which are basically security configuration guides. So it's a document with a set of recommendations about how to configure a given technology. But we have somewhere around 140 benchmarks. Next slide. And those things contain, 92 of those benchmarks we can actually analyze from a data perspective because they're in a database. Some of them are still old and in a document, so I haven't analyzed those because I don't want to read through all of them. Next one. 39 of those benchmarks have some recommendations in them that are scored. So in other words, they matter to an enterprise, but they're not automated. Okay, so we automate the benchmarks. So basically we use SCAP, for lack of a better way to put it. It's not quite SCAP, but close. And 39 of those benchmarks, of those 92 benchmarks, have some recommendations, at least one, that doesn't have that automation to it, even though it's still something that would be scored for the enterprise. Next slide. Okay, so in those 92 benchmarks, there's 6,012 scored recommendations. And those things we have, one more, sorry. 5,120 of those, see, this is why I didn't want to stand up here. 5,120 of those have automation behind them. So we can automatically go out and assess against more than 5,000 of those recommendations. Okay, next slide. And you'll see where this is going in a second. So we have something called artifacts, which are really endpoint attribute types. Okay, so we only have 112 of those that matter. in those 5,120 recommendations that we check. So these are real world things. We have more than 1,000 members. Those are big members where all of their subsidiaries are actually members also. We're in more than 200 different countries. A lot of people use this stuff. One more. Those 112 endpoint attributes that we're looking at really require 72 oval test types. One more. Performing 18 distinct operations. One more. And they're looking at only 5 different data types. Okay. Yeah, I know it's a long chain to get here, but okay. One more. Doesn't seem so bad, right? I don't think it seems very bad. One more. Except there's those 892 recommendations that ought to be automated but aren't, that I can't yet analyze because they're not digitized. All the recommendations are stuck in prose right now. So I haven't analyzed those 892 yet. So we might find some surprises there. I think that's the next slide, actually. Yeah. Will something discovered there have a dramatic impact? I'm not sure. Do you have a question now?
Yeah, just because I've heard of other efforts that boil data down, and maybe it's a difference from theirs to how yours is boiled down. Do you need those 6,000 to get to those 5? Or could it be sliced and diced? Could you have been, could that 6,000 number be a lot lower?
No. There's 6,000
Okay.
recommendations. There are specific recommendations. Well, let me back up. Yes, they could. I'm not sure how much. And the reason I say yes, they could is because we'll use password length because everybody knows it and it's on everything, right? We could make one recommendation that says make a password length greater than or equal to 14. And that could apply to all the Windows variants, all the Linux variants, all the network device variants. That would be one then recommendation that would apply to many, but on the ground you'd still have distinct checks for each one of those things, technology specific, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
The problem is that one policy item, like, you must have a valid, your password length must be set to X, can often relate to multiple configuration settings for a given platform. So it's if you really want to know what aspect of it is not set in order to manage that and actually make a change to it, you kind of need that more fine-grained view. If you're simply just looking for am I compliant or not, that higher abstract view is fine. So it depends on the perspective that you're ultimately looking for.
I think it also depends on the type of data that you're using and how you boil that down. Because the example that I was thinking of was from, why am I blanking on the vendor's name? Open IOCs. Who's the vendor for Open IOCs? Yeah, so they had, I don't know, let's say their number was like 500 things they could look for. And what they found was only 62 or something were being used. And this is a few years back, right? So touting large numbers doesn't always matter, but it depends on the data set that you're looking at. And so, they realized they really only needed 62, but they have to tout large numbers because people like hearing them. But we don't have to tout large numbers if we don't need them. But like in your example, you need them. So I just wanted to poke at that and just see where it could be reduced, but
we need the larger number, but we need a smaller number to actually support that larger number.
Yeah,
right?
it's a different problem than what they hit. Right? Because you're using that data and reducing it down, whereas they have each of those things and they're either being used or they're not being used.
Go ahead.
So it's just a point of how we look at it to simplify.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that they're very specific to looking at indicators of compromise for malware versus all of.
That's not my point. Is very general.
But even
it's just
then,
the type of data we're working at. Does it get crushed down or is it selected from? Right. So Adams gets crushed down, so he needs it. The other one is selected from.
So the 112, Chris Nacio, the 112 is the automated ones?
112 is the actual attributes that we're looking at. We have a definition for endpoint attributes. We have 112 distinct definitions. They're parameterized. So we multiply that 112 into the 5,120. Does that make sense?
5,000 is the automated. So
5,000 is the number of things we check in an automated manner.
Okay, and how many man years is invested in doing 5,120 automated checks?
I don't know the answer to that question. Sorry.
Wait, don't you own the, no, developing them, right? You own the team that developed those?
Yeah, I do, but I don't calculate how many man years it takes to do all 5,000. Like, I can tell you roughly how long it takes to bring a benchmark to market. But that's the entire consensus process, leading in a team of people to define the recommendations and all that.
All right, sorry. So it's not, there's all the legwork before actually writing the code.
Tons of legwork. Yep.
Okay.
And actually, we're hoping to minimize that by starting with looking at the attributes first and worrying about the pros later. But that's a different discussion.
Do you have any numbers on, like, for specific use cases, like if detecting if a vulnerability is present versus a misconfiguration? What underlying mechanisms are needed to be able to support those?
Let me move forward, and then I think we can talk about that. Is that okay? You good with that? All right. One more. Thank you. So we also run this thing called the Oval repository, which is a bunch of vulnerability definitions. And I went through all of those, and basically that adds another 21 Oval test types. So that 72 number becomes 93. But so what? And I guess the point is that this is a specific use case, right? Where most of those that I looked at were not just some of them were inventory. Most of them are vulnerability type. They're not configuration type. The other ones, all configuration. This adding the 21 types, Dave, are all vulnerability checks, right? We could further look into that and say, okay, well, what are the real things that we're looking at? Because that's just a test type. It doesn't say anything about the actual attributes within each of those test types, what are called Oval items we're actually looking at. We can do further analysis there. But it still doesn't seem so bad. So next. And then I see this number 408. Sorry, what do you got? Go ahead. Because I only got.
I was just thinking, this was based on Oval.
Yeah.
Based on our previous conversation. It would be actually really interesting to look at the relevant Yang models and see use this as a basis to figure out if there's coverage in those
where the gaps are
or not.
Right.
To your question earlier about providing feedback to some of those efforts.
I should just claim something also. They're not necessarily, so that is the number of Oval checks, but we also have a proprietary checking system, and we also support SCE. So that's the script-based thing, so that doesn't count in the Oval checks.
Okay.
So there's still further analysis that needs to be done in those areas as well. But then I look at this information model number that has 408 different information elements, and I wonder, is there a way we can trim it down? I'm not sure, but it seems like a lot. Next. Thanks. And then there's this, which I won't make you read, but generally, if you go read the latest edition or the latest architecture submission, the individual draft that we talked about earlier, this paragraph to me, when I read it, seems to imply that the information model can't really be narrowed that much, because we have to basically account for everything that's out there. So then I asked myself, well, is there a way to do that enveloping idea, right? Where we can use these different models and just plug them in where they make sense, and then only take the information necessary. Like, so can the information model represent a configuration check and then not care about the details of that configuration check unless you have to, and only worry about the metadata of that configuration check? That's a different problem to solve rather than trying to put all the little details into the information model. Next slide. So yeah, summary, and I know I went quick. Existing set of checks don't seem too daunting. Whatever, I'm not grammatically correct, I guess. We have a large set of proposed information elements, and the most recent architectural thoughts seem to imply that we might need all of those. But what's the real answer? So next slide. These are kind of maybe the questions we might ask ourselves. And this isn't for here. This is setting up for on-list discussion, I hope, because I don't think we know enough yet to answer it. But anyway, that's it. Questions, comments at this point? Because what? No, they can laugh at me if they want to. I mean, just ask the people that work for me. They laugh at me all the time. It's good. I know Bill's listening. That's why I said that. All right. That's it? That's it.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Dave, real quick, for that question you're asking, were you just trying to find out the, what's the set of, if you look at like all the CVEs, which percentage of that relies on configuration versus?
This is Dave. It was two questions actually. So I was looking at, based on Adam's data, it would be interesting to know like what oval test types are needed to support vulnerability. You're checking for vulnerabilities, versus checking for misconfigurations. Because our experience working with SCAP has been that you need a much smaller number of tests to look for vulnerabilities than you do for configurations, because you're largely looking for simple vulnerable conditions like, is a piece of software installed, or does a file exist that is vulnerable, or maybe is this feature of the product turned on, and that's where it may actually grow a little bit. So it'd be really interesting to look at that number.
And that's supported, right?
Yeah.
In what we saw here, it's 72 for config and
93 for
total. So we added 21. There were actually 30. There is some overlap. There's something like 33 that we use for vulnerability or something like that, but it was a much smaller number.
Right. And so right now, all that information in SCAP is being sourced from Oval. My second question was, could we look for other existing management sources of information as part of the SACM effort that would also satisfy the information need that we're trying to address to do these kinds of assessments? Is there existing work that we could take advantage of in maybe a future version of SCAP that would expand our reach, that would make it easier to take advantage of some of these existing efforts like Yang and NetConf and others? So
all right, so I guess with that, I'll try to talk to the CVE guys and see if we can get an idea. I don't know if they track that, but to try to understand what are those configuration items they're checking. I'll see if that information.
Yeah, if we can get CVE data, that's better than the Oval repo data, because the Oval repo is much smaller than the set of CVEs.
Yeah,
definitely. So, okay, cool. Thank you.
This is Stephen Banghart from NIST, and I just wanted to point out, mostly for the record, that there's been a number of hallway conversations over the last couple of days, and we've been having conversations about how to reduce this number, because I personally think that 400 is probably a little high as well. And there's a couple of plans being talked about on how to boil down that 400 number and get closer to something that identifies the more key attributes and the more key subjects as a way of reducing that 400 number. So there has been some conversation, and I'm sure that conversation will come to the mailing list soon, and we'll get everyone involved in trying to figure that out.
Okay. Thank you. Hank? What?
Could you help me raise the mic?
Yes.
Thanks.
Do I need to wear that?
Nah. It's just me. Thanks. Hello, I'm Hank Burkholz, and I will just give you a quick recap of the development in terminology since the last face-to-face meeting, and also a quick outlook again, as it is traditional for this meeting. Next slide.
Oh, housekeeping?
Yeah, okay. So we added a lot of mandatory terms that were basically finalizing and stabilizing in the information model. And they did their work. They were able to resolve a lot of confusion about how subjects, attributes, and the composition of complex information work on the mail list. And thanks to Jim and other contributor feedback, we were able to basically finish those. And I think they will be of use in any case, however the architecture will develop. With the exception of SACM content, it was quite difficult and quite a task to define what we will actually be transporting. But the discussion about the functions, interfaces, the interaction model, and then the actual content will resolve that finally. Next slide, please. We made some general improvements about not identifying things, but labeling things and characterize things. There was a lot of privacy concerns last year. And we targeted that by introducing specific kind of labels, which are not to be confused with the ICN labels. It is a way of re-identifying objects that occur in a second domain and are relevant to security assessment. Also, we resolved the very general term of guidance. People were always talking about guidance, but actually meant the goal they try to achieve, so in order to be compliant, and then the guidance that enables them to achieve that by, for example, providing a specific method or some guidance how to do a check or how to do a test. Both of those were always called guidance and created a general confusion, I guess. So now we have imperative guidance, which is the how to do things, and the declarative guidance, it is what to achieve. Then the collector still, unfortunately, is only in improvement. I guess the dividing line in figure 2 of the new architecture shows why there was confusion. We will now contain the zoo of leverage protocols to the collecting side of the architecture and have a better understanding what single-use data model we can use on the other side. So collector will probably stabilize with that resolved. Next slide, please. In accordance to the planned work on the architecture, we will revisit a few terms, which are basically functions, as discussed, as a cornerstone for developing capabilities, interactions, and operations. And then we will totally revise, I suppose, the term of role, a little bit away from the general architecture that is virtualizable in the parked working group draft, more to the idea of Jim's actual components, and everybody can put a real meaning to and have a better understanding what we built with the components provided by the old parked architecture. And this is actually the composability of second components. There was also whole talk about how components in the end will look like. If we want to actually have a very static and prescriptive kind of components, or if we want to have the absolute modularity by having functions being the blocks that compose basically everything. That's a minor, if we are coming to that problem, basically we are done. So these are the next steps. So if we actually decided on composability of components, I think a lot of the drafts will have been finished. The terminology draft, as always, continues to be in development until the final second draft is going into last call, and then we can actually complete also the terminology in last call. Thank you. Oh, questions, of course. There's an easy statement here. If not.
All right. Is it rolling now? Rolling.
Okay, my name is Stephen Banghart with NIST, and I'm going to give a presentation about the resource-oriented lightweight information exchange, or ROLI. This draft is actually in the MILE working group, but is important context to a draft that was recently published and will hopefully be adopted into SACM. So this will be a brief introduction to what ROLI is and why it is important to the SACM working group. Next slide, please. So there's this problem that we set out to solve, that point-to-point communications for sharing information requires a very high degree of coordination between the components that are communicating. This amount of coordination about talking about how this communication is actually going to work makes any kind of wide-scale distribution surprisingly complicated. You have to, or maybe not surprisingly complicated, you have to have all these components, have all these pre-established and coordinated efforts in order to establish a mesh or distribution of information. And this causes this entire point-to-point system to be fairly difficult to automate because machines are relatively bad at coordinating things beforehand. This is in direct opposition to one of the requirements of many security organizations, which is to collect the information from a wide number of sources and a wide different kind of information. And so you'd have to be able to establish all this coordination for all these different data types and all these different sources, and that's a hard problem. So if I could have next slide, please. And so I think the PDF has broken the fancy animation that ran on this slide, so I think everyone will have to live with just the static image. This is an example of what a message-oriented publish and subscribe model would look like. No, the animation doesn't matter. It was like, it's just the arrows fade in and out. I was very impressed with it, but it doesn't matter. Don't worry about it. Consumer A and B are two consumers that would join a pub sub model and receive pushed out published information. This is the standard kind of process. Consumer C joins the community later and now has no way of easily retrieving all of this historical published information. He lacks this historical information and he lacks a way of getting it easily. Next slide, please. And this is an example, again, of the message-oriented point-to-point classic request-response model. A client or consumer requests or sends either a request for a specific piece of information or a request for a search term, and the server responds. The issue arises when the client doesn't know the resource identifier or search term beforehand. The client must more or less keep pinging the server over and over again in order to find the information that it needs. And that requires not only more bandwidth across the wire, but more time and more round trips. Next slide, please. Rolly is a solution that intends to address some of these problems and some of the shortcomings of the point-to-point classic messaging situation for sharing security automation information. Rolly is a information sharing repository system that provides a great deal of metadata on the information that's being held, that allows clients to more easily discover and search this information without having to take a large number of round trips and without having to download all of the information that it's trying to search. The exposure of this important information ends up providing a great reduction in the amount of work that it's the reduction in the amount of coordination that has to get done. I mean, the whole problem with this is the amount of coordination, and this reduces that amount of coordination. Another core goal of Rolly is to provide granular access controls. This is intended not only for public distribution, but for internal sharing within a sharing consortium. And Rolly is intended to be able to serve both of these use cases either separately or at the same time by providing access controls to independent groups of information. And at the end of the day, this is about automation. We want to make information sharing more automatable and require less round trips. So next slide, please. Rolly was originally a draft in MILE that was intended for sharing IODEF indicator and incident information type, that data format, the IODEF data format. It was repurposed more recently as a general information sharing solution, no longer limited to just sharing IODEF, but actually content agnostic and not tied to any particular data format. And so Rolly is intended to provide this mechanism for characterizing information in a way that's ultimately content agnostic. By using this metadata exposure, we allow sharing and characterization of information without needing to care about, more or less, what the actual data format of the content is. So next slide, please. Rolly is resource-oriented, and the general idea of how resource orientation looks is instead of constantly making round trips with a server to collect information, the client can make a discovery request the server responds with a relatively small list of the information that it has with that characterizing metadata. And then the client can select from that list of discovered information. And then the server actually responds with the particular resource that is needed. Next slide, please. And again, this is the resource-oriented version of a publication and subscription system. And this supports a pub-sub protocol like XMPP, for example, and allows a client and a server to use this same discovery and characterization mechanisms that save time with the direct response. Dave?
Just to clarify here, I think this slide is intended to illustrate that both in addition to the request response discovery style exchange that we saw in the previous slide, Rolly can also be designed to work with existing pub sub mechanisms. So it can notify a client that a new record is available, and then the client could also then go and retrieve the metadata relating to that record. So this is kind of a hybrid case where it can work.
And sorry, go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, Zap. Nancy Kim Winget. So since you put EGXMPP for PubSub, and Dave, to your comment of it can fit with any PubSub. So in particular, I'm not as familiar with like AMQP or DMTT, but with XMPP, they do have capability discoveries. So in the XMPP speak, what you're calling metadata or the data available that the server can provide, right? In XMPP, that's called a topic, effectively.
Right.
That can be broadcast so that there wouldn't have to be. So I'm trying to figure out if Rolly would be like an extension or a new extension to XMPP that would replace that discovery mechanism?
So Rolly is actually an extension, and we're gonna. I think the next slide starts to talk about what Rolly actually is from a technical standpoint. It's actually an extension to the Atom publishing protocol and the Atom syndication format, and so it would play nice with XMPP, but provides this discovery mechanism through an existing protocol.
It's a REST-based protocol. The purpose of this slide is to show that we can send notifications of new entries being posted to the Rolly repository over some messaging protocol to allow clients to receive notifications. So, you know, we could post on a topic that a new record is available, and then the clients that actually care about that information could then, you know, go to the Rolly server to request it as an out-of-band communication.
Yeah, and it may be more clear as well as we go to the next couple slides, which have some examples of what things may look like, which may help. So we'll go over really quick, and not in a whole lot of detail because we don't have a whole lot of time, but this is a really quick overview of what Rolly actually is and what it actually looks like. So Rolly is an extension to the Atom syndication format and the Atom publication protocol, which are both IETF standards, specifications. That Atom syndication is a syndication format similar to something like RSS, and it provides a historical list of entries. And Atom publication protocol is the protocol for creating and retrieving those entries. So the service document is what provides the discovery mechanism in Rolly. It is an XML file that exists in a standardized location and lists a number of collections or feeds of information. And these collections are characterized using categories. It can have one or many categories. So this service document will not be very big. When a Rolly client wants to see what information a server holds, it does a GET request, for example, HTTP GET, to a known location that's the same for all servers, and retrieves this service document that provides a list of collections, and each collection, what categories of information it holds. There's no embedded content, there's no huge XML elements, so these service documents are small. This is the discovery request part of that picture earlier. And this is what gets sent back. So now the client, having gotten this document will say, okay, this collection looks interesting to me. This has the kind of information that I'm looking for. Maybe in this case, it's vulnerabilities. This collection is vulnerabilities. So it sends a GET to the identifier for the collection, and the server is going to respond back. So if I have next slide, please. This is the response, gets the feed or a collection. It's more or less similar. The feed then is a list of metadata about a feed and then a list of entries. And each entry is one particular piece of information that falls within the categories of the feed. So in this case, each entry would be something that is in the vulnerability category of information. And the entry is elided here, but the list of entries only contain content links and not embedded content. So again, it's not very large. The feeds all link to service documents. So there's full transversal across these things. And the entries look something like, next slide, please. Oh, sorry. This is the paged feeds. So feeds support paging and archiving. So you actually can page through feeds. If these things get particularly large, for example, some vulnerability feeds could push into the tens of thousands without much trouble. You can page them, and it goes in reverse. It goes in chronological order, so you're always getting the most recent things first, and you can very quickly navigate to the information that you're looking for. Next slide. This is what an entry looks like. This is more or less the size and the kind of things that an entry holds. We can see the meta information at the top about a Rolly entry. The Rolly format element identifies what format the content is in, and this is not a. The actual attribute namespace here is not set by Rolly. Rolly does not talk about the data formats. It's agnostic to that. This is a way of identifying for the benefit of consumers of these entries. And then source links to the actual raw content itself. So if I was interested in this particular vulnerability, I would run a GET on that content element. So next slide, please. The reason that this is relevant to you and the reason this presentation is happening in SACM is Rolly has an extension system that allows you to identify and add new information types, such as vulnerability. And these information types are expressed through the category element, like we saw with vulnerability earlier. These information types are all registered in an IANA table that the Rolly core document creates, and the extension documents register new values to. For example, we have in MILE a document that is the Rolly CSERT extension, and that identifies two new information types in the IANA table, incident and indicator. And those registered information types can be used then in any Rolly repository. Check time here. Doing okay on time. Next slide, please. So the document that was recently published as a 0.0 draft and hopefully will be reviewed by you all here in SACM is the Rolly Software Descriptor extension. This extension introduces a new information type, software descriptor, which is information that identifies and characterizes software installers and packages, and software packages. And this does not include running software either. And this may sound familiar because we were just talking about the SWIMA data model, which actually covers very similar information. And a Rolly repository is actually a great place to get the information that SWIMA is interested in. The Rolly repository can aggregate and store these software descriptors, and SWIMA can utilize that store of information as it needs. And wherever a Rolly repository doesn't exist, SWIMA operates in its place as well. One of the example data formats that may support this information type is ISO 2015 SWID, which we consider a software descriptor, and so it belongs in the software descriptor information types. So a Rolly feed that provides software descriptor information may hold ISO 2015 SWID as an example, but again, it's agnostic to the actual data format itself. Next slide, please. So the Rolly core draft, which is in MILE, is currently in version 5, and it's in working group last call. And we really, really need more review. We really need more eyes on it. We need more feedback. We need people thinking about it and looking at it. Anybody who could provide review on that Rolly draft, we would absolutely appreciate it. And the relevance there is the Rolly software descriptor extension. Moving forward, we would really like that to be reviewed and adopted into SACM. It provides SACM relevant support in Rolly for software descriptor information. And that document needs reviewed and some developmental help as well. It's a brand new document. It's very much work in progress. But software descriptor is not the only extension that we believe is important to Rolly. There's a number of different information types, such as configuration setting checklists, vulnerability records, and bulletins that don't have drafts for extensions yet. If that type of information is important to you and belongs in an information sharing system like Rolly, we'd love to see those drafts get written. And me and Dave are the primary authors at the moment. We are more than willing to help anybody put together those extension documents. There's 2 extension documents that already exist that are valuable templates, and we're more than willing to help people beyond that as well, help figure out what extensions might look like, what information types you might be interested in, and how it kind of fits into this Rolly system as a whole. Next slide, please. Okay, discussion. So if there's any comments, questions, anything either about the Rolly core itself, which is in MILE, or the Rolly software descriptor extension, be more than happy to talk about it, explain a little more. This was a brief overview, so if anyone has any clarifying questions to ask, please do.
I have one question. How many points of extension are there?
Okay, so the category element is the primary extension point. There are some discussion points currently open about adding new extension points. Those issues are currently open. We're thinking about adding some arbitrary characterizing information exposure. For example, some Rolly property element that may allow you to expose identifying information for the content. Like IODEF has ID, for example, and ID doesn't quite belong in category because it's not really a category. So there's some discussion around adding a property element that can do that. Dave?
So Rolly uses the Atom syndication format as its underlying model, and there's 3 primary extension points in that model. There's link relationships, which allow you to establish relationship arcs between two sets of or 2 information records. So that's one extension point. Second extension point is the categories, like Stephen mentioned. Rolly further refines the use of categories as far as defining the information type category for which we're maintaining an IANA registry. So you extend that information type category by adding new values, new information type values to that. That's kind of the core focus of these extension drafts, which then allows us to orient other requirements around the use of other extension points relating to a given information type. And then the third is AtomPub allows you to add arbitrary data elements, XML data elements into the model. So if the existing link and category relationship, or the existing link and category extension points are not adequate, you can always add a new element to the model that would describe other arbitrary information.
So when you say arbitrary, you mean arbitrary?
Arbitrary, yeah.
Okay. And somewhere in one of the drafts I was reading, this is all as a contributor, sorry, I just didn't want to walk up to the mic. It was ambiguous as to whether it meant an Atom element that was optional or anything.
It's anything, any information in any other namespace, basically.
That makes more sense. All right, cool.
Yeah, Atom lets you add whatever you want to the end of any kind of document.
The client isn't required to
Understand.
do anything more than just ignore that information, but
Yeah.
it's there.
Okay.
The overall approach to it is ignore, over, fail. allowing people to add whatever information they seem fit for their particular local use.
So are there any questions about Rolly? Any others? Links.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the category element with information types as a subclass is the second one. Yeah.
So Adam was talking in his last presentation about all the checklists, that CIS has, for configuration settings. That's certainly something that we have in mind that would be a potential information type.
It's on the way.
What's that?
It's on the way.
Sweet. And relative to the vulnerability assessment scenario, one of the things the assessment scenario kind of punts on is the transport mechanism that could be used to aggregate, vulnerability records. This is actually a transport that can be used to, to provide those information records. But you need to figure out models as far as, that would provide the information for, for a vulnerability record. That's an ongoing need in the community, but, a vulnerability information type, I think, would be a natural fit for the vulnerability assessment scenario. We'd welcome working on a vulnerability-oriented draft with anyone who's interested.
Question on that. Do you envision that being for the, I'm going to get this wrong, I think, but for the vulnerability description information or for the vulnerability detection data?
Could be both, actually.
Both. Okay,
Yeah, and that can either be contained in the same model or it could be contained in different models, and that would be an example of a link relationship maybe from one to the other. There's a number of different ways we can approach that.
Sweet. We can probably work with you on that as well.
Awesome.
Contributor, sorry.
Yeah, so we feel that Rolly can actually provide a ton of utility to SACM for actually a whole bunch of different use cases. There's a lot of ways that Rolly can really help this space. And we would love for SACM to take part in some of the Rolly discussions, both here and in MILE. The MILE working group meeting is on Friday. It's the last session of the day. So if you're still around, we'd love to have you there. We're going to go in more depth on the Rolly core document, as well as discussing some of those main discussion points I brought up earlier, as well as open issues in Rolly. So if you're interested in helping develop Rolly as it enters working group last call, please come and find us at MILE. Thank you. Any more questions? No? Okay.
MILE is on the last slot on Friday.
Last slot. The last thing. What? Right. All right, cool. So that was the last actual presentation of the session. I have a question to ask, or it's one thing, like if we have time, and I think we do, to talk about. So would anybody find value in having a more regularly available instant messaging ability in the group between some of the core people? I know we have a SACM room that's always on that we can use. We just don't normally see people in there. I don't know if that's because people don't want to use it or because they don't or what, but does anybody see value in doing this?
For what it's worth, Jim and I have been hanging out a little bit in the SACM Jabber room. It's been kind of lonely in there.
And I know Jabber's going to be favored.
Yeah, so I've noticed even in meetings and sessions, people have a preference towards going in through Meet Echo into the room, and no one goes directly into the chat room. So I wonder if it's more of a habit thing, and people aren't used to pulling up a Jabber client and getting connected.
Don't know. It's becoming more difficult to use it, though, in my opinion. Like,
really?
To me, some of the apps don't support it as well as they used to. Like, it's just not as hot an item these days.
I use ADM and it works great, and I even have OTR with that.
Okay.
I don't know.
So this is Stephen Banger from NIST. This is my personal take on this. Jabber is a little bit difficult to get set up on Windows. Many of the apps are outdated, haven't been updated in several years. They all look like they haven't been updated in several years. It can be somewhat difficult to set up Jabber, especially if you are not super technical. Even if you are, it's a little bit non-intuitive. It provides great functionality. I think it's just not as streamlined as some of the other available options. And I think a lot can get done in this group if there was a place where we could get questions answered quickly and kind of have these hallway discussions digitally in SACM, if you will, right? A place to actually do that. The mailing list is a place to have more in-depth discussions, but just for quick questions. I think that,
yeah, I think generally it's hard to have an actual conversation over email.
Yes.
By instant messaging. So if we want to have
We're feeling old back
conversations,
here. We don't care about interfaces.
So what, whatever. If people in the group think that it would be valuable to have something like this, we can certainly look into it more and talk about it on the list, get to some solution. We just have to be careful if it's not like the Jabber room to make sure that decisions aren't made necessarily in that environment, but that they're taken back to the list and ratified and so on, right? So
I would like to propose Slack as an alternative, not for any kind of consensus making, but as a rapid fire instant messaging solution.
Okay.
As one option.
Yeah, that was just my concern about, decisions being made and tracking that and getting it back onto the list, but we're good.
Okay, so we'll explore further on the list. Everybody's like eager to leave, I can tell, because there's conversations going on. Sorry, guys. So way forward. How? Oh, it's okay. I feel old every day. Don't worry. I feel young. You feel young? It's because you're working with Steven. All right, way forward-ish. Okay, we won't type everything up here, but generally we've got these two IESG submissions that are going through, right? And this is more macro level, not necessarily the individual next steps, but the architecture draft reconciliation, like whether we do a draft or not, I think that one of the next things we need to worry about is enumerating the functions, the operations that we want. Maybe we use that vulnerability scenario for what we wanted to use it for and start with that and just discover, soup to nuts, what that workflow looks like. And then from that, start working on the information model. We'll learn more when we dive deeper into that vulnerability scenario about what we actually need in the information model and then how we can deal with that. The envelope problem. And then, of course, we can start thinking about how we recharter, maybe. I'm looking at Kathleen over there.
Hey, it's up to you guys. I'll just,
It's coming up, is all I'm saying. So I want to think about it because it's coming up in January-ish.
Yeah, so the notes on that, it was because there is a timeline.
Yeah.
The only other working group I have that has a timeline on their charter has it shaped to their work. The timeline for the SACM charter isn't really shaped to the work.
Okay.
So if we're going to keep a timeline on there, it has to be shaped to the work. It should come from you guys because, frankly, I think it was originally put there so with Sean that the working group could be closed if sufficient progress wasn't made. But an AD can just close the group anyway if you're not making good progress. And you've turned that around. So, there is better progress, not perfect. I'd love it to continue to improve. The
improvement is trending in the right direction.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. So we do have to think about that for the next charter. Some of the newer ISG changes, right, with personnel. And so that was a sticking point for a number of people, whereas a few years ago when it came up, it was a non-issue.
Okay.
So thank you. I'll help with that.
Okay, thank you. That's it. Any comments, closing questions, any other business? Nothing. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. And we hope to see you throughout the rest of the week and on the list. And maybe in Slack or something else. Nobody's awake enough to enjoy humor this morning. All right. See you guys.
I'd like to catch up with you later in the week.
Okay.
But I can't. I got to run right now. But
Oh, great.
no, I just want to get.
Nice
I
guy.
just want to next
I
steps.
don't think I've ever seen one.
Administrative stuff.
I'm waiting for
I just can't.
Okay.
I'm
I've known Dr.
feeling fairly miserable in that function. So.
Okay, all right, great.
Whenever, you're all week. And actually, for a long time on Saturday, because my flight doesn't usually leave until 6:30.
And my flight doesn't leave till 6:05.
Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. Cool.
I
Well,
was
thank
hoping
you.
to do something fun on Saturday, but it looks
you
like
okay?
it might rain. Huh?
Did I do all right?
Oh, you did fabulous.
Good. Just want to make sure. I've been on the ring.